My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 28. And if there's one law governing my family, it's this: image comes first, truth comes last. And I'm always the one who pays the price for that hierarchy. I wasn't surprised when they looked down on me. I grew up with it. The whispers, the sighs, the looks that screamed, "Why can't you fit the mold?" But nothing prepared me for the moment a man who was practically a stranger, my sister's new fiancé, leaned back in his chair during Sunday dinner and asked if I was still unemployed, like it was the punchline of a joke he'd been dying to deliver. Everyone laughed. My dad even nodded, validating the insult. And for a second, I almost let it slide. I almost swallowed the poison the way I always had. But the thing about humiliation is that sometimes it strikes exactly when you are done pretending. And sometimes, the person who thinks he's untouchable accidentally says one sentence, one tiny detail that exposes more about his fraud than he ever intended. Because while he kept talking, acting like he owned the room, he mentioned a financial term that didn't fit. Something that made me stop breathing for a split second. Something he should have never said in front of a forensic auditor. I didn't call him out that night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flip the table. I just watched him talk. I let everyone enjoy their laugh. I waited quietly until the moment his own words would circle back to act as the noose. And when they finally did, their faces didn't just turn pale, they turned to stone. Before I tell you exactly what he lied about and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The dinner took place on a suffocatingly quiet Sunday evening. I drove back to my parents' estate in Connecticut with that familiar constriction in my chest, the physiological response to entering a hostile environment. It wasn't just anxiety. It was the body's warning system flaring up. Their street looked exactly the same as it did when I packed my bags for college a decade ago. Manicured hedges cut with surgical precision, mailboxes standing like sentries, and grand colonial houses pretending that absolutely nothing unpleasant ever occurred behind their reinforced oak doors. The illusion of perfection was intact, polished, and rigid as a court order. I parked my sedan, took a stabilizing breath, and stepped into the foyer. My mother was positioned by the marble kitchen island, arranging hors d'oeuvres like she was curating a museum exhibit rather than preparing a family meal. She greeted me with a thin, tight smile that felt more like a compliance checklist being ticked off than an expression of maternal affection. She didn't ask how I had been. She didn't ask about my life. Instead, she glanced at the wall clock and asked why I was cutting it so close, as if my arrival 3 minutes before the scheduled hour indicated a fundamental character defect. I had grown accustomed to these remarks that hovered in the gray area between polite concern and critical judgment, but they always landed with the same heavy impact. My presence in this house was tolerated, never requested. My father sat at the head of the dining table, sifting through a stack of investment correspondence, barely lifting his eyes. He acknowledged me with a curt nod, the absolute bare minimum effort required to avoid being classified as rude. There was no warmth, no hint that he was pleased to see his youngest daughter. I took my assigned seat quietly, blending into the background as I always did. 7 minutes later, the atmosphere shifted. My sister, Emily, walked in wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, followed closely by her new fiancé, Marcus Thorne. This was the man who had turned their pragmatic world into a stage set for his personal charm offensive. It was the first time I had observed him in a controlled family setting. He moved with a confidence that bordered on theatrical performance, striding into the room like he was auditioning for a lead role he already knew the casting director had promised him. My parents lit up the instant he crossed the threshold. Their postures straightened, their expressions brightened into genuine delight. I didn't need a psychological evaluation to spell it out. He was exactly the kind of asset they wanted to merge with the family brand. We sat down, and the conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. I listened as my mother asked Marcus about his week, laughing a little too loudly at his generic anecdotes about closing deals. My father encouraged him to share more about his fraud detection strategies, or rather, what he claimed were high-level financial maneuvers, nodding along like he comprehended every nuanced detail. My sister beamed, visibly pleased that the spotlight had naturally settled on Marcus without her having to steer it. They were all participating in a meticulously scripted play where I hadn't been given any lines, and frankly, I had no interest in joining the cast. I kept my head down and focused on the appetizer, but the atmosphere was impossible to filter out. My mother occasionally glanced at me, her eyes scanning for any sign that I planned to contribute something of value to the discussion. My father seemed visibly relieved every time I remained silent. The dynamic wasn't new, but it felt sharper that night, more jagged. It was as if everyone had signed a non-disclosure agreement beforehand that I shouldn't disrupt the perfect tableau they were painting. But deep down, I knew the truth of this family. We were only as good as the image we projected, and I was the smudge on the lens. It didn't take long for the table's collective attention to shift toward me anyway. It always did. It wasn't curiosity. It was a ritualistic performance review. My family had a specific way of inspecting me under the guise of casual conversation, searching for updates that would either confirm their disappointment or offer a glimmer of hope that I was finally conforming. They measured human worth in the simplest, coldest terms: job titles, corner offices, six-figure salaries, and milestones they could brag about at the country club. Anything that didn't fit that rigid corporate mold was considered a regression. So when the moment came, it arrived quietly but with the predictability of a market crash. Marcus turned toward me with a look I'd seen on countless people who thought they had me figured out. After 2 minutes of silent observation, he asked casually about my work. His tone was light, almost friendly, but beneath the veneer was a calculation and expectation that I would provide a stammering answer that reinforced whatever narrative of failure he had already crafted in his mind. I answered simply, "I'm doing independent consulting, offering nothing extra." I watched his expression change in subtle, microscopic ways: a twitch of the eyelid, a slight tightening of the jaw. My mother shifted in her seat, and my father's grip on his wine glass tightened. They didn't say anything, but the silence was loud enough to underline their profound discomfort. My sister avoided eye contact, busying herself with her fork as if the salad was the most fascinating thing in the room. The air grew heavier, not because of what I said, but because of what they imagined my vague answer meant: failure. Marcus took this shift in mood as a tactical opportunity. He leaned back slightly, studying me with an ease that felt practiced, like a shark circling a wounded seal. He began talking about his latest ventures, his portfolio, his high-level connections, weaving it all together in a way that positioned him as someone impressive, accomplished, and enviable. My family listened eagerly, absorbing every detail as if each word was gospel truth that confirmed he was the savior they had been waiting for. I sat still, watching, listening, waiting. Nothing dramatic happened in that specific moment. No raised voices, no arguments, no confrontation. But the way he spoke, the specific financial acronyms he used, the regulatory bodies he mentioned in passing, something about it snagged my professional attention. It was a variance. A discrepancy. Not enough to react on the spot, but enough to leave a mark on my radar. The mood shifted as the evening grew quieter. It happened in a way that felt rehearsed, as if the night had finally reached the climax everyone else had been waiting for. Conversation drifted, plates were cleared, and the laughter around the table softened into a warm background hum. That was when Marcus leaned forward slightly, scanning the room with the satisfied ease of a man ready to deliver his closing argument. I recognized the rhythm. He had been building toward this all night. He made a comment about ambition vague enough to sound philosophical, pointed enough to land exactly where he intended. It was wrapped in a light tone, but the meaning beneath it was sharp as a scalpel. My mother laughed first, quick and polite, the kind of laugh she used when she wanted to encourage a certain social direction. My father chuckled in agreement. My sister gave a restrained smile that didn't reach her eyes. The next remark came smoother, more direct. Marcus mentioned people who float between projects, people who take their time finding purpose, people who don't really contribute to the economy yet, but talk like they do. The table laughed again, louder this time. I felt every sound hit me with a familiar sting. Mockery disguised as bonding. Amusement built on the assumption that I wouldn't push back. I didn't respond. Not yet. Silence had always been my shield, the thing that kept me from feeding into their expectations. Then Marcus turned to me fully. He didn't need to say my name. The implication was clear before the words even formed. He asked if I still had free time during the day to watch TV. A gentle phrase that carried the weight of a label I'd heard more than once: unemployed. It was casual enough that he could deny any malice, but obvious enough that my parents exchanged knowing looks. My mother sighed a small, controlled exhale that suggested she'd been waiting for this confirmation of my laziness. My father rested his hand on his glass, swirling it slowly as if preparing to deliver a lecture on work ethic. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the predictable pattern unfolding in front of me. It always happened this way. Someone implied I was less than, everyone laughed, and the responsibility for ruining the mood would fall on me if I dared to react. It was an old script, one we'd performed too many times for it to be accidental. Marcus continued talking, expanding on the idea of stability, success, and the grind. He spoke like a keynote speaker addressing a room of eager acolytes. My family listened with genuine admiration, each nod reinforcing the version of him they wanted to believe in. My sister watched him as if he were the embodiment of everything she'd hoped to introduce to the family. But I watched him with a different awareness, the awareness of a forensic auditor spotting a cooked book. As he shifted into describing his job in more detail, I caught the first real irregularity. It was small, almost imperceptible, the kind of detail 99% of people would overlook. He mentioned a specific type of compliance audit for a merger, claiming he authorized it personally. But in the financial world, that specific audit isn't authorized by external consultants. It's a federal requirement handled by internal officers. It struck me as odd, a fundamental error in his terminology, but not enough to trigger a reaction yet. I filed it away quietly in my mental dossier. My mother reacted to another one of his statements with a proud smile, commenting that some people at this table could learn from that mindset. My father murmured agreement. The implication wasn't subtle. It was the same message delivered 1,000 different ways throughout my life. Contribute more. Achieve more. Be more presentable like Marcus. I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because silence allowed me to study every detail without drawing attention. Marcus's confidence grew with each passing minute. He talked about strategies, fiduciary responsibilities, meetings with board executives. He layered his stories with jargon and vague references enough to impress anyone who didn't understand the terms. But something about his explanations felt too smooth, too curated, like he had memorized paragraphs from a Wall Street Journal article and stitched them into a persona he wanted others to see. I didn't call him out. I didn't question anything. I simply listened, observed, and memorized. By the time dessert was served, the table was fully committed to the illusion of Marcus's success, his intelligence, his stability, but beneath the surface of his words, I recognized a pattern, details that didn't align, descriptions that contradicted his earlier claims, professional boasts that felt strangely empty of substance. I didn't know exactly what was wrong yet. I didn't have the documents yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. His story wasn't as airtight as he wanted everyone to believe. And that quiet realization changed the entire game. The days that followed moved with an unusual, dense heaviness, like the air before a thunderstorm. I returned to my apartment after the dinner, feeling drained in a way that sleep couldn't fix. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was a mental residue left behind from being forced into a familiar, shrinking box, the role where I was expected to absorb the laughter, the judgment, and the subtle ways my family measured human worth. Yet this time, something lingered beneath the surface, something sharper than embarrassment or frustration. It was professional curiosity, the kind that doesn't go away once it settles in. It was the itch, the instinct that had made me good at my job. The first inconsistency I noticed during dinner replayed itself in my mind the next morning, looping quietly while I brewed my coffee. Marcus had described authorizing a Section 404 compliance review for an external merger. It sounded impressive to my parents, but in my world, that specific review is internal. Consultants don't sign off on it. Officers of the company do. At first, I wondered if he'd simply exaggerated to impress my father, padding his resume verbally. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit. The timeline he gave for his promotion didn't align with the fiscal quarter he mentioned. Suspicion alone wasn't enough to pursue anything. People embellish all the time. It's the social lubricant of the insecure. But the certainty with which he talked, the performative precision, the broad statements reinforced with vague terminology, felt too deliberate. It nudged something in me, a sense that I hadn't been shown a resume, but a script. A quiet afternoon arrived, providing the space to think clearly. I sat on my couch, my laptop open, phone silent, replaying every detail I could remember from dinner. The way my mother leaned in when Marcus spoke, the admiration in my father's nod, the way my sister's posture changed whenever he described his accomplishments. And woven into all of it was the contrast, their complete dismissal of me the moment Marcus painted me as someone drifting without direction. That part shouldn't have mattered. I had long stopped seeking validation from them, but it wasn't their reaction that stayed with me. It was how confident Marcus felt delivering a narrative that shifted the room instantly. A narrative he supported with statements that didn't align with the truth. So, I started with the simplest step: OSINT, open source intelligence. I didn't dive into anything deep or invasive at first. I looked for public information, basic employment records, company structure, leadership names, published white papers. Nothing was out of bounds. Everything was available to anyone willing to look. And, ironically, the information I found didn't immediately confirm anything wrong. On paper, everything matched the image Marcus presented. His LinkedIn was pristine. His bio on a third-party conference site was glowing. But the details he used during dinner? They didn't appear anywhere. Not in job descriptions, not in team structures, not in the summaries of ongoing initiatives. They were pieces that existed in different roles, different divisions, different offices entirely. It was a Frankenstein profile stitched together from legitimate parts to create a monster that didn't actually exist. Even then, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he worked on classified cross-functional assignments. Maybe he had responsibilities not listed publicly. Yet, the more I examined it, the more the gaps widened. A day later, I reached out to David Chin, a digital forensics specialist I had collaborated with during a previous contract. David was the kind of guy who could find a needle in a digital haystack and tell you who manufactured the steel. I didn't mention names. I didn't describe the family drama. I kept it professional, asking a general question about the workflow in that specific investment firm's analytics wing regarding Section 404 authorizations. The answer came back quickly, clear, detailed, and completely incompatible with the story Marcus had shared at dinner. David confirmed that no external consultant had touched those files in 3 years. That was when my curiosity sharpened into something else: resolve. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet, but I knew where to start. Patterns don't reveal themselves in a single glance. They reveal themselves piece by piece through inconsistencies that echo louder the more you notice them. Marcus's stories had too many polished edges, too many phrases that sounded learned rather than lived. I spent the next evening reviewing everything with fresh focus. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't a reaction to the insults he'd thrown at me. It was instinct. The same instinct that had guided me through complex fraud analysis work. By the time the sun set, I felt something click quietly inside me. Marcus wasn't just someone who exaggerated, he was someone who performed. And when performers rely on scripts, the reality always reveals itself the moment they step off the stage. I didn't confront anyone. Not my family, not my sister, and certainly not Marcus. I simply allowed the questions to guide my next steps, knowing that I needed concrete documents before I made a move. Everything that followed began with that single decision to look closer. The next phase of the operation began quietly, almost without a conscious plan. It started with a simple, encrypted message to David Chen. David was the kind of digital forensic expert who remembered small details the way other people remembered song lyrics. He could track down information without leaving a single digital footprint in the snow. He wasn't a close friend, but he respected my work ethic and trusted my judgment implicitly. When I asked if he had time to look into something sensitive, he didn't ask why. He only asked for the target parameters. I didn't give him Marcus's full life story. I didn't mention my family, the disastrous dinner, or the personal insults. I kept it strictly professional: just a name, a claimed employer, and a few vague questions about employment verification records. David agreed to run a background check, said it might take 48 hours, and that was enough. I closed my phone afterward and forced myself to step away from the situation, at least physically. But distance didn't quiet the analytical engine running in my brain. I found myself reviewing everything I'd observed recently. There was a rhythm to Marcus's behavior, a cadence that felt familiar to anyone who studies white-collar crime. He presented himself as someone important, someone whose mere presence demanded respect and high-level clearance. People responded to that unshakable confidence, my family included. The more I studied him in my memory, the clearer it became that he wasn't just maintaining an image. He was aggressively protecting a fortress. The polished confidence, the curated anecdotes, the seamless way he redirected specific questions all pointed to someone who had rehearsed every version of himself before revealing it to a live audience. The idea didn't make me angry anymore. It made me focused. Late that evening, David sent a secure message saying he had found something unusual in the public filings. It wasn't immediately illegal, nor was it flashing neon red, but it was strange. Marcus's name appeared on paperwork linked to a small consulting entity registered out of a virtual office suite in Delaware, a classic move for anonymity. The company had no website, no staff listings on LinkedIn, no project history. It existed on paper and nowhere else. The discovery didn't surprise me, but it deepened my curiosity. People register small LLCs all the time for tax purposes. But when someone boasts about high-level responsibilities at a major Wall Street firm while quietly attaching their name to a shell company with zero activity, it raises serious questions about their intentions. It hinted at parallel work, shadow work that they didn't want tied to their main profile. I asked David to look deeper. He didn't hesitate. While waiting for his findings, I continued my own OSINT research. I searched for the keynote presentations Marcus claimed to have given. I looked for the conferences he said he attended as a VIP, the industry publications he referenced. None of it appeared anywhere. Not even in the scattered corners of the internet where niche professional talks are usually archived. Every claim looked clean on the surface but was completely hollow underneath, like a movie set storefront with nothing behind the windows. The following day, David sent a longer, more detailed update. He had managed to trace small transactions linked to the shell company, irregular deposits spaced across several months. The amounts varied, but they all appeared to come from personal accounts under different names, not corporate entities. There was no indication of legitimate business activity, no invoices, no vendor listings, no corporate contracts. It resembled something informal, something built on handshake promises rather than deliverables. And suddenly, the memory of Marcus describing private investor engagements during dinner made sense in a way I wished it didn't. He wasn't collaborating with institutional whales. He was collecting quietly from individuals, likely people who trusted him because he sounded knowledgeable enough to believe. I didn't jump to conclusions. In my line of work, you don't assume criminal intent until you see the money trail. But the pattern was undeniable. Marcus wasn't the person he portrayed, and his professional identity leaned more on performance art than actual finance. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like clarity, cold, steady clarity that settled somewhere deep inside my chest. I didn't tell my family. They wouldn't have listened. Not without undeniable proof. My mother would have dismissed it as jealous speculation. My father would have told me to stay out of his business. My sister would have defended Marcus because protecting the image of her perfect engagement mattered more than examining the truth. So, I kept everything to myself. I reviewed every file David sent. I rewound every memory from that dinner. I pieced together every detail that hadn't made sense at the time, but now formed a coherent pattern of fraud. It wasn't just exaggeration. It wasn't harmless embellishment. It was fabrication layered carefully over reality, polished until even he likely believed his own narrative. By the time I closed my laptop that night, one thing was certain. Whatever Marcus was building behind the scenes, it wasn't stable, it wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't harmless. Whether my family wanted to face it or not, the reality was going to surface one way or another. I just needed to make sure I had the documents ready when it did. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, sooner than I had calculated. It was a heavy, cream-colored envelope with raised gold lettering, sitting in my mailbox like a court summons disguised as a celebration. I carried it inside and opened it without a flicker of hesitation. My sister's name, Emily Bennett, was printed across the top in an elegant, flowing script, paired with Marcus Thorne's in a matching font. The card listed a date, a vineyard venue in Napa Valley, and a request for guests to attend a celebration of new beginnings. I stared at the card longer than necessary. Not out of sentimentality, but out of a quiet, chilling awareness of what this event would actually become. It wasn't a wedding invitation. It was the final piece of evidence in a case file I was mentally assembling. The next morning, I submitted my RSVP online. I marked attending, closed my laptop, and let the confirmation email sit unread in my inbox. It wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't driven by spite, jealousy, or a desire to disrupt their happiness for the sake of chaos. It was purely practical. If there was going to be a moment where all the disparate threads of truth converged, it would be there. At the place where appearances mattered most to my family, the impact of the fall would be irreversible. Silence followed. My parents didn't reach out to ask if I planned to come, likely fearing I would bring my bad attitude with me. My sister didn't text to share excitement or logistical questions about bridesmaids' dresses. They all moved forward with their lives as if the dinner had never happened, as if the distance between us was a natural geographic feature rather than a canyon dug by their own choices. I didn't mind the quiet. In my line of work, silence is useful. It gives you space to think, to observe, and to plan the takedown. A few days later, a priority message from David Chen appeared on my encrypted messaging app. He had found something new in the records, something that shifted the situation from merely suspicious to legally actionable. I opened the file he sent, scrolling through transaction lists, timestamps, and spreadsheets he had reorganized for clarity. The deposits into Marcus's shell company weren't random. They formed a distinct mathematical pattern when arranged chronologically. The amounts increased gradually, then spiked, then leveled off. To a layman, it looked like business growth. To a forensic auditor, it resembled the heartbeat of a Ponzi scheme staged rounds of personal fundraising used to pay off earlier investors, rather than income from legitimate work. The more alarming part came next. David had traced 2 of the incoming payments back to individuals who had filed small claims disputes in the past for unreturned investments. Nothing major, nothing publicly tied to Marcus's main alias yet, but enough to show a direct connection between his private activity and disgruntled participants. It wasn't definitive evidence of criminal conviction, but it was substantial proof of a structure built on lies. I sat still after reading the file, absorbing each detail with a calm focus that surprised even me. It wasn't just about the desire to expose him anymore. It wasn't even about protecting my family from embarrassment, a concern I had long stopped carrying. It was about recognizing the sheer scale of the financial fraud he was capable of causing if no one intervened. My sister wasn't just marrying a liar. She was marrying a liability that could bankrupt our parents. A week before the wedding, the venue sent out a mass email reminding guests about the schedule. My sister forwarded it to the family group chat, adding a short, breezy message about the dress code and parking instructions. I responded with a simple acknowledgement. She reacted with a thumbs-up emoji. It was the most contact we'd had since the dinner, and it felt like a transaction between strangers. On the day of the rehearsal dinner, I received the final nail in the coffin from David. This file contained something different, screenshots from a niche online forum where users discussed private investment opportunities. A profile that matched Marcus's writing style and IP address appeared repeatedly, promoting a revolutionary project described with buzzwords but lacking transparent documents. Some users praised him initially, but then, the tone shifted. Recent comments questioned the legitimacy of his claims. One user mentioned losing a significant amount of their 401k. The post dated back nearly 2 years. That was enough. Not enough for the SEC to kick down the door immediately, perhaps, but enough for me to understand the danger my sister would be stepping into by legally tying her assets to his. I didn't make a plan in the traditional sense. There were no long rehearsals in front of a mirror, no dramatic build-up, no rehearsed monologue designed to hurt feelings. I simply gathered everything. Every spreadsheet, every inconsistency, every piece of information David had uncovered. I printed them out and stored them in a single, plain manila folder. Facts didn't need embellishment, they didn't need a soundtrack. They only needed the right moment to be seen. The wedding provided that moment. I placed the folder on my desk that evening, organized and ready. I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't even feel vindictive. I felt steady, grounded by the understanding that truth doesn't require theatrics, it only requires timing. And when that timing arrived, I intended to be fully prepared to present the documents that would shatter the illusion forever. The wedding morning arrived with an odd, suffocating stillness. I drove to the venue without a shred of urgency, my tires crunching slowly along the gravel road leading toward the vineyard estate in Napa. The sky hung low and heavy, a muted slate gray that refused to cooperate with the festive pastel floral arrangements lining the path. Guests moved in coordinated clusters, adjusting silk ties, smoothing designer dresses, and laughing that polite, hollow laugh that wealthy people use at social obligations. I walked alone, carrying nothing but a small, unassuming clutch. Inside rested the manila folder. It wasn't heavy physically, but its presence grounded me like an anchor. The ceremony began without delay. My sister walked down the aisle looking radiant, hopeful, and dangerously unaware. Marcus stood at the altar waiting with that practiced confidence, wearing a smile that seemed carved out of marble. Applause rose as she reached him. Vows were exchanged, promises of fidelity and honesty that I knew were already broken. Rings slipped into place. Cameras flashed, capturing the lie in high definition. Everything unfolded smoothly, flawlessly, like a performance designed solely for a highlight reel. Then came the reception. Tables filled, crystal glasses clinked, and conversations overlapped into a roar of congratulations. My parents floated through the room, greeting guests, beaming with a pride that felt brittle. Emily and Marcus made their grand entrance, soaking in the adoration. They looked like the perfect couple, the perfect American success story. And maybe that was why the timing felt right. Because illusions are most vulnerable exactly when people believe in them the most. I waited until the speeches were finished and the guests began drifting toward the open bar. I walked toward the newly married couple with steady steps, not hurried, not hesitant, just inevitable. My sister saw me first. She looked surprised, almost relieved, offering a tentative smile as if my presence meant I had finally capitulated. Marcus noticed only when I stopped directly in front of them, blocking his view of the photographers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't create a scene. I simply opened my clutch, pulled out the folder, and held it out to him. He glanced at the papers, then at me, a flicker of confusion flashing across his face. My sister leaned in, her brow furrowed. "Sarah, what is this?" "A wedding gift," I said softly. Marcus took it. His eyes scanned the top page, a summary of the shell company's transaction history. Then the next page, the forum screenshots. Then the third, the list of small claims disputes. His demeanor cracked immediately. It wasn't a slow fade, it was a structural collapse. The arrogance drained from his posture, replaced by a flicker of raw, animal panic he couldn't mask. His mouth tightened, his cheeks flushed a deep crimson. He reached for excuses that fell apart before they could form on his tongue. My sister stepped back slightly, her breathing uneven. "Marcus?" Guests around us began noticing the tension. The bubble of laughter burst, replaced by cautious murmurs. My parents approached, their expressions shifting from irritation to alarm when they saw the papers trembling in Marcus's hands. I didn't explain. I didn't accuse. I didn't narrate his crimes. I only said one sentence. Calm, steady, undeniable. "You should know who you married." The silence that followed was heavier than any screaming match I could have engineered. Marcus's reaction did the rest. His defensiveness, his frantic, stuttering attempts to dismiss the documents as misunderstandings, his failure to provide a single coherent explanation. Each response revealed more than the files themselves ever could. My sister watched him unravel in real time, the polished mask she had fallen in love with collapsing into dust in front of 300 witnesses. My parents reacted exactly as I expected. They turned on me. My mother hissed that I was trying to ruin the day out of spite. My father grabbed my arm, whispering furiously that I was making this about myself. Their words carried no surprise. They were echoes of every moment they had dismissed my perspective in favor of whoever stood taller, spoke louder, or projected certainty. I didn't stay to defend myself. I didn't wait for validation or apologies. I stepped away from the toxic cluster forming around the couple, walked past the rows of untouched wedding cake, and headed toward the exit. No one followed me. Not my parents, not my sister, not even Marcus, who was too busy scrambling to salvage the debris of the image he had constructed. Outside, the air felt lighter, cleaner. I reached my car, placed the now empty clutch on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment, letting the muffled sounds of the reception fade behind me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was clarity. Sharp, clean, long overdue. Cutting ties wasn't dramatic. It wasn't painful. It was necessary surgery. As I drove away from the vineyard, leaving the chaos in my rearview mirror, I understood something I had spent years resisting. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the one that protects you. Sometimes the role they assign you is too small for the person you actually are. And sometimes, walking away isn't abandonment. It's the ultimate act of self-respect. If you've listened to my story all the way through, thank you for giving it your time. And before you go, tell me in the comments section, what do you think is harder, speaking up when everyone wants you to be silent, or finally walking away when you realize they never listened in the first place?